It's time we settle the debate. In a world that's as volatile and divided as today, should the notion of individual responsibility really give way to collective action? I don't think Jordan's been challenged on one of his core individualist ideas like this, because this conversation with Slavoj Zizek forced him to think again about this ancient wisdom that lies at the root of this country's foundation. Perhaps that gave Jordan Peterson the opportunity to dig much deeper into why he believes the tradition of individualism is still relevant. But before you see that, this lengthy question posted by Zizek has more than enough food for thought than we need to explore.
What I only don't quite get, why do you put so much access to this? We have to begin with a personal change. I mean, this is also the second or which one, I don't remember, forgive me, of your slogans in your book. You know, first set your house in order, then. But I have an extremely common sense, naive question here. But what if in trying to set your house in order, you discover that your house is in disorder precisely because the way the society is messed up, which doesn't mean, okay, let's forget about my house. But you can do both at the same time, and I would even say, I will give you now the ultimate example, yourself. Isn't it that you are so socially active? Because you realize that it's not enough to tell to your patients, set your house in order. Much of the reason of why they are in disorder, their house, is that there is some crisis in our society and so on and so on. So my reproach to you, benevolent, would have been, you know, the joke, tea or coffee, yes please. Like individual or social, yes please, because this is obvious in extreme situation. Like, I hope we agree to say to somebody in North Korea, set your house in order. No, haha. But I think in some deeper sense, it goes also for our societies. I'm just repeating what you are telling. You see some kind of a social crisis, and I don't see clearly why insist so much on this choice. Because, sorry, just to finish, I will give you an example that I think perfectly does it. How do we usually deal with ecology? By this false personalization, you know. They tell you, what did you do? Did you put all the Coke cans on the side? Did you recycle all paper and so? Yes, we should do this. But, you know, like, in a way, this is also a very easy way to discharge yourself. Like, you say, okay, I do the recycling, so up. You know, I did my duty.
Well, as good of an objection as that is, I think there's two critical differences that Zizek is missing with the notion of individual responsibility. First of all, individual and collective action are not mutually exclusive, and of course, they don't have to be. But that's not the question. The question is which precedes what. The 6th chapter of Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life, answers this question. It says, quote, set your house in order before you criticize the world. Jordan doesn't say you can't criticize the world or that there's no eventual domain for action outside the scope of the individual. But if your own proximal life isn't made the starting point for action, the daunting sight of global collective problems can too often paralyze people into inaction in both domains until they realize they've ended up nowhere. And I think there's a second difference as well, which adds another layer to Zizek's example of North Korea. When you're taking an extreme example like a totalitarian dictatorship, you're actually proving one important point. The amount of individual responsibility you're expected to have is proportionate to how much personal agency and freedom you have. In other words, when you're in America or any functioning free society, you have more than enough wiggle room to make your life better, but when you're stuck motionless as part of a stifled group, collective under the thumb of a tyrant like North Korea, that's when collective action starts to make more sense, and I mean more sense, not absolute sense, because that's something that has been said for cleaning up your individual act, even in North Korea. That's because you can at least stop being a cog in that terrible machine where you can. Don't lie or snitch on other people, don't serve as an informant against your own people, don't get your family into needless trouble, and make sure you don't lose sight of your individual conscience and morality. If you've read the book Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, you understand how these are truly the last few of human freedom that remain, even in the most tyrannical dictatorships and systems, and they have a ripple effect that goes far beyond you can foresee. But I want to show you the tangent that Jordan Peterson took in response, which I believe shows a different perspective that perhaps only reinforces the same old wisdom that stood the test of time.
So first of all, I have to point out that you have unfairly tasked me with 3 very difficult questions. And so I'm hoping that I can...
That's life. That's life. As you said, life is a challenge.
Yes.
And
So look, there's a very large clinical literature that suggests that if you want to develop optimal resilience, what you do is you lay out a pathway towards somewhere better. Someone comes in, they have a problem. You try to figure out what the problem is, and then you try to figure out what might constitute a solution. And so you have something approximating a map, right? And it's a tentative map of how to get from where things aren't so good to where they're better. And then you have the person go out in the world and confront those things that they're avoiding, that are stopping them from moving towards that higher place. And there's an archetypal reality to that. It's you're in a fallen state, you're attempting to redeem yourself, and there's a process by which that has to occur. And that process involves voluntary confrontation with what you're afraid of, disgusted by, and inclined to avoid. And that works. Every psychological school agrees upon that, is that exposure therapy, the psychoanalysts expose you to the tragedies of your past, and redeem you in that manner. And the behaviorists expose you to the terrors of the present and redeem you in that manner. But there's a broad agreement across psychological schools that that works. And my sense is that we're called upon as individuals precisely to do that in our life, is that we are faced by this unbearable reality that you made reference to when you talked about the situation on the cross, is that life itself is fundamentally, and this is a pessimism that we might share, is fundamentally suffering and malevolence. But, and this is I think where we differ, I believe that the evidence suggests that the light that you discover in your life is proportionate to the amount of the darkness that you're willing to forthrightly confront, and that there's no necessary upper limit to that. So I think that the good that people are capable of is actually, it's a higher good than the evil that people are capable of. And believe me, I do not say that lightly, given what I know about the evil that people are capable of. And I believe that the central psychological message of the biblical corpus, fundamentally, is that. That's why it culminates, in some sense, with the idea that it's necessary to adopt, it's necessary to confront the devil and to accept your, what would you say, the unjustness of your tortured mortality. If you can do that, it's a challenge, as you just pointed out, that's sufficient to challenge even God himself, that you have the best chance of transcending it and living the kind of life that will set your house in order and everyone's house in order at the same time.
Don't you think we see something similar in almost every domain where you're called on to take part in a collective action? Take example change, for example. There's hardly any effective action you can take that isn't ultimately down to you as an individual. The ability of a city or community to reduce its waste or increase recycling starts with you as an individual being more responsible in where and how you dispose of your waste. Reducing carbon emissions means it's you who can choose to use something like public transport or even walk rather than using your car, and it's you as one of the only a few people in the world that have access to the deepest recesses of your life and your house to make it in line with that collective goal. That's how you start to see that collective action. It's just individual actions seen at scale, and they don't work unless the individuals in that collective can lift up their own weight to move toward that shared goal. And I think that's what our old wisdom already found out. As Jordan Peterson once put it, the individual is the ultimate minority. The individual is the brick that makes the wall, and it's impossible to build a straight wall unless the individual bricks can straighten up themselves. It's worth mentioning that Slavoj Zizek is a communist and likely does not agree with what he may regard as an overimportance and overemphasis on this notion of the individual, but for each of us, our individuality in all its feelings, choices, freedoms, and rights is the most real thing that exists, and that counts much more than any hazy notion of collectivization.
So the pathway towards adopting individual responsibility happens to be a very individual one, but I do believe that the best bet for most people is to solve the problems that beset them in their own lives, the ethical problems that beset them, that they know are problems, and that they can set themselves together well enough so that they can then become capable of addressing larger scale problems without falling prey to some of the errors that characterize, let's say, over-optimistic and intellectually arrogant ideologues. I'll close. Well,
Yeah, but very briefly.
let me close with one thing. One of my favorite quotes from Carl Jung, it's actually a quote that I used at the beginning of my first book, which was called Maps of Meaning, was that if you take a personal problem seriously enough, you will simultaneously solve a social problem. And this bears on your point, because it's not like your small family, even the relationship between you and your wife, is immune in some sense to the broader social problems around you. And so let's say right now there's tremendous tension between men and women in the West, and that's certainly the case given the divorce rate. Let's say that would be some evidence. And the later and later ages that people are waiting to become enter into permanent relationships. There's a real tension there. And then if you do establish a relationship with a woman or a partner, but we'll say a woman in this particular case, you are instantly faced with all of the sociological problems in a microcosm in that relationship. And then if you work those damn problems out, if you can work them out within your relationship, then you can get some insight. It's not complete insight, but you can get some partial insight into what the problem actually is and get the diagnosis right, and you've moved some small measure forward in addressing what might constitute the broader social concern. And what's even better, you're punished for your own goddamn mistakes. And that's another thing I like about the idea of working locally, is that, if I do broad-scale social experiments and they fail, it's like, well, tough luck for the people for whom they failed. But if I'm experimenting on myself within the confines of my own relationship and I make a mistake, I'm going to feel the pain. And that's good, that's just, but it also gives me the possibility of learning. And so I believe that you do solve what you can about yourself first before you can set your family straight and before you should dare to try to set the world straight. Otherwise, you degenerate into this kind of, you already talked about it, this shallow moralizing. Well, I've divided my goddamn Coke cans up, and now I can spend more money on new packaging at the supermarket, which is exactly what the psychological research indicates that people do if they perform a casual moral act.
Perhaps the only thing you can safely say is this: both notions of collective and individual responsibility have had their trial run in the past, and we've seen how collective responsibility can go quickly becoming a slow glide to tribalism. And that's where things like tribal warfare and identity politics of today are even coming from. Both Jordan and Zizek are completely different characters in that regard, but perhaps the only common denominator between them is that they still value their individual freedoms and rights. If that's the case, Zizek may be one step away from admitting that there's really very few collective causes that can justify taking those away, as Jordan Peterson and Slavoj Zizek stand on the opposite sides of that line. That may be the only thing that divides these two great minds.